The Ottoman Empire lasted for 600 years and dominated the Middle East and Europe, from Budapest to Baghdad and everything in between. Its sultans ruled 3 continents, but they didn't do it on their own. This podcast looks at the cast of characters who made the empire run: the sultan, the queen mother, the harem eunuch, the merchant, the peasant, the janissary, the holy man, and the outlaw. Welcome to Ottoman Lives. We're continuing our series on Ottoman lives, and now we're going to look at the person of the concubine, the slave girl in the Ottoman imperial harem that might remain a concubine, but she might become the mother of a sultan. Now, to talk about this issue, we're not just talking about concubines, we're really talking about the role of women in the Ottoman Empire, and more broadly speaking, the role of women in the Middle East. The images that probably come to mind aren't positive. Peasant women completely shrouded in black and forced to walk 10 paces behind their husband, resembling the condition for women in Saudi Arabia now, but worse. On the higher end of the social strata, the numerous wives and concubines of the Sultan are locked away in the harem and forced to attend to whatever carnal whims enter his mind. So how true is this image? Well, in many ways, women had fewer rights in the late medieval Middle East than their European counterparts. Sharia law allows a man to have up to 4 wives. Divorce between the two parties was simple to obtain for a man. All it required was for him to repeat the dictum, "I divorce you," 3 times. It was so simple, in fact, that Ottoman court records are full of situations in which divorce occurred by accident, when one member of the party said the statement joking and didn't realize that the words were legally binding. While men could divorce easily, a woman's ability to initiate a divorce carried a financial penalty. It was more restrictive. So that's on the lower end of the spectrum, but what about conditions for upper-class women? It was different than Europe. The Ottoman sultans did not marry foreign queens. Rather, their wives were of slave origin and came from the harem. Since royal Ottoman concubines and wives were almost invariably from Christian lands in the Balkans, Armenia, or the Crimea, nearly all Ottoman sultans had a non-Muslim, non-Turkish woman as their mother. Or at least they weren't Muslim by origin, but later converted to Islam. This marriage system was likely a reason why the Ottoman Empire lasted for 6 centuries. Unlike medieval Europe, fiefs and domains were not constantly being contested due to royal marriages and the uniting of their lands to different households. But in other ways, Middle Eastern women had more freedoms and sometimes had more rights than their European counterparts at the time. They were landholders and had the right to control property. Some held fiefs used to pay for the state's military expenses. Women could register complaints to provincial courts on all sorts of matters, from property infringement to sexual violation. Thousands of these court records survive today, and they demonstrate that the state acknowledged these complaints and attempted to rectify them. Women could collect taxes on a local level and invest it into simple manufacturing businesses, such as silk production or textiles. Certain sectors of the economy were dominated by women, particularly cotton spinning. All right, so that's my long preamble about women in the Middle East and women in the Ottoman Empire. In this episode, we're going to look at the lives of, I would say, 2 of the most powerful women who rose through the system, Harem Sultan and Mahpeker Kesem Sultan. They were both wives of different sultans, mothers of sultans, and had a lot of power behind the scenes. First, I'll mention what the harem was and what it did before I look at their lives individually. The harem refers to the private domestic residence, and by extension, its female inhabitants. The royal harem at Topkapi Palace, where the Sultan held court, was particularly important because this institution was charged with the reproduction of the dynasty. The harem was by no means this free-for-all orgy for the Sultan. It was really quite the opposite. Sex and reproduction were carefully regulated within the harem, and especially within the royal harem. Albertus Bobovius, who was a Polish slave serving in the palace, compared the harem to a monastery due to its rigid hierarchy and enforced chastity of many of its residents. And that's because the children born to these women determined royal succession and was very crucial in politics. The word harem even comes from an Arabic word meaning forbidden or unlawful, but also sacred. The royal harem was a labyrinth of hallways, private apartments, libraries, dining rooms, mosques, and salons, which grew over the years with building additions. And the population within the harem also grew as a result of the dynasty increasingly preferring seclusion behind the walls of the palace. The queen mother, or valide sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, was at the top of the harem hierarchy. Below her, the royal harem's population was divided into two groups: family members and harem administration. The family members included royal offspring, including underage boys and girls who had not yet entered puberty, and also royal consorts and unmarried or widowed princesses. The high-ranking harem administrators, all of them women, had large stipends and enjoyed considerable prestige. They supervised servants who worked in the harem and managed the training of select young women who had been chosen for higher things, such as marriage to a pasha, which was a general, or a chief administrator, or service to the sultan, or the valide sultan. So the harem trained girls and women for service to the dynasty, just as the palace school trained young boys to become janissaries. So like the boys being trained as janissaries, the young girls who entered the harem were also slaves, although in their case, they were usually captured beyond the borders of the Ottoman Empire, whether in slave raids or in the course of war. Those who left the harem to marry a member of the Ottoman elite were manumitted before the marriage. The most important task of the harem was the production of male heirs to ensure the continuation of the Ottoman dynasty. The Ottoman Empire was unique that it relied exclusively on concubines for this. Until Hürrem Sultan, there were no wives in the harem. But there were several advantages for the concubinage system and not having wives or queens or whatever. Because the Sultan could have as many concubines as he chose, there wasn't much of a danger of the Ottoman dynasty remaining without a male heir, as often happened with European royalty, so you wouldn't have civil war break out or extended family members battling for the throne. Also, under Islamic law, the husband and a wife were bound to each other through a number of rights and duties. This would limit the Sultan's absolute authority, but there's no such problem with a concubine. There were powerful concubines in the palace, but like everyone else in the palace, their power came from the ability to play the political game, but a wife would have legal guarantees. An ambitious girl could have no higher goal than to give birth to the Sultan. This would raise her far above other concubines, but put her in the running to become someday the valide sultan. And there was no more powerful woman in the empire than the mother of the Sultan. At any one time, there were likely several mothers and sons living within the confines of the harem. So palace politics revolved around the struggle to secure the throne for one's offspring. This wasn't an issue at the harem alone, because prominent men and women in the palace formed factions and threw their support behind one candidate or another. And they found other ways to exert their power. Ottoman princesses and their consorts could endow religious foundations and free slaves, and other acts of charity to endear them to the public and form their own faction and make it powerful so they could win out in political struggles. Ottoman women were laid to rest in imperial tombs after being honored in imperial funerals. They were the wives of sultans. The death of the mother of Sultan Süleyman was met with an outpouring of grief. So even though women in the palace harem were secluded, they were known and loved in an abstract way by the general public. Now, if we're going to talk about concubines, I have to talk about the most famous product of the Ottoman harem system, and that was Roxolana, or Hürrem Sultan, one of the most powerful of the women that came out of the system. Hürrem was a Slavic woman who was forced into concubinage and later became wife of Ottoman Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, the first such woman in the harem system to become a wife and not a concubine. And through her influence on Süleyman, and due to her own political skills, she wielded considerable power in the palace. Her birth name was Alexandra Lisowska, and she was born in 1505 in the town of Rohatyn in modern-day western Ukraine near Poland. In the West, she's known as Roxolana, probably as a reference to her Rusin or Ruthenian roots. When she was a young girl, she was captured by the Crimean Tatar raiders, a Muslim group that lived in what is southern Ukraine in the Crimean Peninsula, and taken to Constantinople as part of the slave trade. There, she was sold into slavery in a slave market, and through her personality and beauty, wound up in the harem. Well, she came to the Ottoman Empire in the early 1500s, which was a good time to arrive, near the beginning of Suleiman's reign. From 1520 to 1566, Suleiman I ruled the Ottoman Empire, and many think of him as the most powerful sultan in the empire's 600-year existence. During his time in power, he made a huge impact on the countries in Europe and the Middle East. When Roxolana arrived in 1520, this was also a year that Suleiman's life took a radical change. In September of that year, his father Selim I died accidentally, and with his death, Suleiman left the province of Manisa in Anatolia, where he was a regional governor, and he was recalled to Istanbul to take the throne. At the same time, he met Roxolana. Well, her influence on Suleiman was almost immediate. It only took a few months from the day that she met him to become one of the most important consorts in the harem. She wasn't strikingly beautiful, but she had a pleasing personality. Her Turkish name, Hürrem, means joyful one, and that's what I'll call her from here on out. And she earned a special place for herself in the harem, but also many rivals. In particular, she attracted the jealousy of Mahidevran Sultan, a concubine of Suleiman, and the mother of the heir apparent Mustafa. Some historians think that these rivalries led to a few attempts on Hürrem's life. Mahidevran, in fact, attacked Hürrem, which was followed by Suleiman banishing her, his former favorite concubine, and her son back to the province of Manisa. Well, Hürrem bore Suleiman her first son, Mehmed, in 1521, and she became his favorite consort. Now, usually, once you gave birth to a son for the Sultan, you were then sent off to the province. This was informally called the one concubine, one child rule. But the bond between Hürrem and Suleiman was more than expected for the society at the time. Because of the closeness of their relationship, this led to the first time in the history of the Ottoman dynasty that the Sultan only focused on one woman. Yes, she was the favorite of Suleiman, but this didn't satisfy her. Ottoman custom meant that she could only have one son with him. But according to the French writer and historian Fontenelle, she decided she had to find a way to marry Suleiman. First, she asked to be instructed in the Muslim religion. Suleiman didn't see a problem with this and took care of her religious education. She then stated she wished to become a Muslim, converting from her Christian Orthodox faith. Well, the stories and chronicles go that this pleased Suleiman so much that he released her from slavery. Hürrem then stated that her new religion would not allow her to have a sexual relationship with a man she was not married to. So Ottoman historiographers, some that didn't like Hürrem, say that her plotting and scheming worked, and Suleiman, even though he resisted for 3 days, eventually married her. Well, Hürrem did not just give birth to one son for him. She gave birth to 6 children. Mehmet, daughter Mihrema, Abdullah, Selim II, Bayazit, and Jihangir. This strengthened her position in the palace so much that she instituted a new order in the harem, and she took as many lessons as she could. She learned mathematics, astronomy, geography, diplomacy, literature, and history, and was fully fluent in the Ottoman Turkish language. She was even interested in alchemy, which is very popular in Europe in the 1500s and 1600s. Excavations at the Edirne Palace show that she had tools to create perfume. Because of her education, she also became Suleiman's advisor on state matters. She had influence on foreign affairs and international politics, and one thing she did was maintain the peace between the Ottoman Empire and the Polish state with the Polish-Ottoman alliance, which was easy for her because she was born in these regions and probably spoke the native languages of ambassadors from there. According to Crimean historians, she also intervened to control Crimean Tatar slave trading. And we even have accounts and archives of her congratulating the new Polish king for his accession to the throne. Here's another thing that we have left over in the archives from Hürrem's time. Suleiman was a poet, and many of his poems are dedicated to Hürrem after she became his wife. He signed these poems as Muhibi, meaning lover or sweetheart. Here's one poem that he wrote. Throne of my lonely niche, my wealth, my love, my moonlight, my most sincere friend, my confidant, my very existence, my sultan, my one and only love. The most beautiful among the beautiful, my springtime, my merry-faced love, my daytime, my sweetheart, laughing leaf. My plants, my sweet, my rose, the only one who does not distress me in this world. My Istanbul, my Karaman, the earth of my Anatolia. My Badakhshan, my Baghdad, my Khorasan. My woman of the beautiful hair, my love of the slanted brow, my love of eyes full of mischief. I'll sing your praises always. I, lover of the tormented heart, Muhibi of the eyes full of tears, I am happy. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Well, in addition to having Suleiman's heart, Hürrem was also a patroness of public works. She commissioned many projects for the Ottoman royal architect Sinan. The first big project, which began in 1539, was the Haseki Mosque complex in Istanbul. Among its components were 2 schools and a hospital. And she was also characterized as a schemer who plotted the assassination of the Sultan's chief minister, Ibrahim Pasha, in order to eliminate a rival influence on the Sultan. One thing she did to increase the importance of her harem was to arrange it to be moved from the old palace to the new palace where Suleiman lived and held court. And she arranged marriages with her children to prominent officials. Their daughter Mihrima was given in marriage to a courtier named Rustem, who became the chief advisor in 1544. So he was chief advisor and son-in-law of the Sultan. And she was also suspected of plotting the executions of Suleiman's other sons born from his other concubines. Well, Hürrem died in 1558 of an unknown illness. Suleiman buried her in a mausoleum, which belongs in the complex of a mosque named after him called Süleymaniye. He died 8 years later and joined her, finding his final resting place in the same complex. And after Suleiman died, Hürrem's son Selim ascended the throne, so she was able to secure her legacy. Okay, so that was Hürrem Sultan, probably the most famous product of the harem system. But now we're going to talk about the most powerful product of the harem system, and that was Kösem Sultan, a queen mother who ruled about 50 years after Hürrem. Kösem understood the freedoms and limitations placed on women in Ottoman society and was able to utilize and manipulate them like no one else. This was despite her humble origins. She was born on the Greek island of Tinos in 1590, at the time a province of the Ottoman Empire. As the daughter of a Greek Orthodox priest, she was raised a Christian with the maiden name Anastasia. Kösem was sold into slavery and purchased by a high-ranking Ottoman official in present-day Bosnia. Noting her beauty, he sent her to Constantinople, the Ottoman capital that the Turks had conquered from the Byzantines in 1453. She was 15 when she arrived, perhaps spoke no Turkish, and immediately brought to the imperial harem. The harem was a large section of private apartments located on the grounds of Topkapı Palace in modern-day Istanbul. It consisted of more than 400 rooms. When Anastasia arrived, she met dozens of other intelligent young concubines like her. They hailed from around the Middle East, the Balkans, and the Crimea. They were either captured in war or recruited within the empire for the harem, as she had been. Upon arrival, the girls were compelled to convert to Islam. Anastasia did as such and took the name Mahpeker Kösem. Her first name, Mahpeker, meant moon-shaped in Persian. Today, that could be a mean-spirited nickname for someone with an enormously large face, but back then it was a compliment on the celestial nature of her beauty. Her second name, Kösem, given to her later by Sultan Ahmet, demonstrates her shrewd character for which she had already gained a reputation, as the name meant leader, free, or independent. Now, the harem was not just a place where women sat idly by and waited for the Sultan to stop by and fulfill his carnal desires. It was more of a cadet training program for elite women in some ways. She was placed in the harem's rigorous education system, where she and the other inductees learned the disciplines of the palace. Prior to this time, she had received little formal instruction, but in the harem, she learned Turkish, she took lessons in theology, mathematics, embroidery, music, and literature. Really, her education was on the level of Isabella of Castile or Elizabeth of Tudor, although she had to start much later. The most important lesson she gained, however, was in politics. The harem staff held enormous power as state administrators. They were typically eunuchs that supervised the females' quarters, but also had influence in the palace because they were in the palace. By the 17th and 18th centuries, they influenced state administration and palace bureaucracy because of their access to the Sultan and his family. The leader of the harem, the chief black eunuch, was sometimes considered the third most powerful man in the empire, behind only the Sultan and the Grand Vizier, or the Grand Advisor. The high-ranking women in the harem were equally powerful, as they had as much informal influence on imperial matters as the eunuchs. All of these figures gained their position through aggressive political jockeying. An impressionable, intelligent young girl like Kosem learned much in this environment, which was as cutthroat as a Wall Street investment firm. The harem cadets were placed at the lowest rung of a viciously competitive hierarchy in which one earned a promotion by attracting the attention of the Sultan. Kosem began as a concubine and was not allowed to leave the palace without the permission of the Queen Mother, or the Valide Sultan. This person was the reigning sultan's mother and a former concubine herself. If a cadet or a concubine managed to share a bed with the sultan, which Kosem came to do with Ahmet I, she became a gözde, or the favorite. If she continued to curry his favor, then she became Iqbal, or the fortunate. A woman to whom the sultan wanted a permanent union would become one of his 4 wives, a kadın, or woman. If she birthed him a son who went on to become a sultan, she became the next queen mother, or valide sultan. Through a combination of her intelligence, beauty, and attractiveness to Ahmet I, she quickly ascended the hierarchy and leapfrogged over senior wives. Upon the enthronement of her son Murad IV, Kosem became the valide sultan, the queen mother. She obtained this title at a time when the position of queen mother was more powerful than the sultanate itself. This time period was known as the Sultanate of Women, a 130-year period in the Ottoman Empire in which the wives and mothers of the imperial harem held extraordinary levels of political power. They ruled informally through their weak sultan husbands or impressionable sons. Kosem had the opportunity to exercise significant control. However, a political reform initiated by her husband, in which he changed the law of sultanic succession, would allow her to spread her rule over 3 generations. And here's how it happened. For over 3 centuries, from the 1300s when the Ottoman Empire rose, up until this period, the Ottoman selection of princes worked according to a simple but brutal system. Young princes of the Sultan were sent to distant provincial cities to rule as governors and learn the art of politics and administration. But the oldest son wasn't automatically declared Sultan when he died. When their father died, the princes rushed back to Istanbul to be the first to claim the throne and earn the allegiances of high-level advisors to the military. That's because Ottoman dynastic succession allowed any son of the Sultan to be next in line for the throne. The empire didn't practice primogeniture, the right for the firstborn son to become ruler. That meant any son, regardless of age, could become the next sultan. This also meant that any brother of the current sultan could take his throne if he could force him out of it. Now, it's not as if they had to rush back to Istanbul and there was some sort of silly capture the flag where the first to sit on the throne won. It sounds like something out of a fantasy book. In reality, the sons knew what the situation was, and they were quietly working behind the scenes to gain the support of the military, the religious class, and other powerful institutions, so all these groups would coalesce and declare him the sultan. It's not as though a weak, incompetent son who had no favor for anyone simply waltzed back to Istanbul first and sat on the throne and people would unanimously support him. Even in an empire or a sultanate, there was still an element of having the consent of the governed. And a new sultan was aware of the perpetual danger that a brother could challenge him to the throne. He at least had the legal right to be sultan. And for a sultan, as long as his brothers lurked around in the empire, he faced the possibility of being deposed. Any sultan who reigned long enough would manage to offend some part of his population, who could in turn throw their support behind the challenger. Young Ottoman sultans accounted for this threat in the beginning of their reign in the most draconian way possible. Upon being named sultan, all of his brothers and pregnant concubines were killed, in order to eliminate another claimant to the throne. It was always done by means of the silk rope of strangulation. Sultan Mehmet III, who reigned from 1566 to 1595, killed an estimated 27 of his preteen brothers. The practice was rightfully considered barbaric by the public and routinely condemned. But according to the political logic of the Ottoman dynasty, it was an act of mercy on society and saved thousands of lives. That's because it prevented the empire from plunging into civil war every time a claimant to the throne battled the sitting sultan for power. And they reasoned, well, better than a few royals die than tens of thousands of the population. Well, this all changed with the rule of Kösem's husband, Sultan Ahmet I. He had an insane brother, Mustafa, on whom he took pity and could not consign to execution. But he also could not let him live freely, since an enemy faction could rise up against Ahmet and place Mustafa on the throne and use him as a puppet ruler. Ahmet struck a balance and sent him to live in confined quarters of an ornate section of the harem. Mustafa stayed in this luxurious but restrictive apartment until his death. These quarters became known as the Golden Cage. They were so effective in eliminating the threat of a dynastic rivalry that the cage became precedent among sultans. Soon, young princes stopped being sent out to the provinces in their youth and were instead placed in these quarters. There they stayed from their birth until their accession to the throne. If they didn't win the throne, they were kept throughout their lives under strictly controlled conditions. Being confined to a restricted space for the entirety of one's young life resulted in princes with poor mental health. Kösem's son Ibrahim was the most notorious example. He was kept prisoner here for all of his life, except during his short, troubling reign as sultan. This seclusion amplified his already weak mental state from birth, and it caused his insanity to reach full bloom upon being released from the cage and ascending the throne. And I talked about Ibrahim in a previous podcast episode about history's most insane rulers. However, it presented Kösem an extraordinary opportunity to rule. She was a regent through her two sons, Murad and Ibrahim, and her grandson, Mehmet. This made her the de facto ruler of arguably the most powerful empire in Europe and the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire stretched from southern Arabia and Yemen to the north coast of Africa, from eastern Anatolia and the borderlands with Persia, through Eastern Europe up to Vienna. It was the scourge of Western Europe, and many Christian rulers feared that it would overrun the continent and completely dominate them. In order to rise to power, Kösem had to first overcome certain roadblocks. When Ahmet died in 1617, the 28-year-old widow arranged for his mentally ill brother Mustafa I to rule, and she exercised effective power in the state during his 3-month reign. Her adversaries deposed him in favor of the child Osman II, which was a setback for Kösem because she was kept under custody in the Old Palace in the Beyazıt district of Istanbul, until young Osman himself was deposed and executed by enemy factions in 1622 at the age of 17. Kösem's son Murad IV became the Sultan in 1623, and she was finally able to project power over the empire. Because Murad was only 11, his mother was named official regent and ruled for 5 years. Although queen mothers of the sultans had gained enormous political power before, they had always ruled in an informal fashion as de facto advisors or administrators. But her stewardship of the empire was the first time in Ottoman history that a queen mother was designated the official regent of her son. She directly governed the empire. Kösem met with foreign ambassadors and learned about global politics. She also appointed political posts and was responsible for maintaining much of the state's administration. Kösem did so until Murad shook off the domination of his mother when he was 16, and it was not easy for him to wrest control away from her. Kösem was not one to receive a setback passively. She still exercised great influence in state affairs when the young sultan was away from the capital. When the chief legal jurist of the empire disapproved of the way that Murad had a judge in the city of Iznik executed, Kösem communicated this fact to him and persuaded him to execute the chief legal jurist himself in retaliation. This was an act that had only occurred 3 times in the empire's history. Through his mother's counsel, Murad was able to accomplish much during his reign. He reconquered Baghdad in 1638. He put down rebellions throughout Anatolia and restored order in the eastern parts of the empire. As an aside, he was also an outstanding field commander with enormous physical strength, able to wield a mace weighing 132 pounds. Chroniclers credit him with these reforms, but it's difficult to know what was accomplished as a result of his work and what was accomplished by his mother. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Murad's reign came to a quick end. He was an excessive drinker, although he outlawed alcohol consumption whenever he could, and quite unhealthy, so Kösem kept her eye on other Ottoman princes through which she could rule upon his death. She particularly kept a close watch on her son Ibrahim, known to history as Ibrahim the Mad for his mental instability. He was born and remained in his gilded cell in his early years, and Ibrahim was considered to have been touched by madness, and because he posed no direct threat to his brother Sultanate, his life was spared from execution. His brothers Suleiman and Qasim were not so lucky and ended up strangled by the silk rope. In the final days of Murad's reign, the Sultan's dying wish was to have Ibrahim killed. There were no others in the royal line to take the throne, but Murad thought it better to end the Ottoman dynasty than to have a madman as a sultan. But due to the intervention of Kösem, this order was not carried out, and she saved the dynasty from extinction. Had she not done so, the empire would have been thrown into turmoil and possibly civil war. When Ibrahim ascended the throne in 1640, Kösem knew her second son was not capable of rule and did her best to curtail his madness. It was not an easy task. Unsurprisingly, a shut-in who had been forced to live his early years as an extreme agoraphobe was poorly prepared to lead a transcontinental empire. He was prone to add bizarre theatrics to his rule. Ibrahim was intrigued with tales of rulers from antiquity and imagined himself to be the same. One story relates that he developed a craze for furs and wanted to acquire as many furs as possible by imposing an extremely heavy tax on his subjects. He was inspired by stories recounted by his court members of legendary princes of old who covered themselves, their furniture, and their entire palaces in expensive sable pelts. He called upon his imperial council and military officials to collect them throughout the empire to make this dream a reality. They politely declined to execute this order and saw clearly the threat that he posed to the stability of the empire. Factions formed to depose this ruler with a more stable one, and the Queen Mother quickly leapt into action. Kösem encountered her greatest challenges at the end of her son's reign. Ibrahim had surrounded himself with a number of power-hungry concubines and wives, every bit as ambitious as his mother. Ibrahim's concubine, Şekerpare, in particular, had significant influence over him due to his overwhelming attraction and preference for her. The story of how she entered the palace is worth recounting. Ibrahim had, over time, developed a preference for full-figured women, and he then commissioned his advisors to find for him the largest woman in the empire to add to his harem. What they found was a woman nicknamed Şekerpare, or Sugar Cube, an Armenian woman weighing 300 pounds, an enormous size for anyone in the 17th century. Due to Ibrahim's obsession with her, she became quite influential and had his ear on political matters, much to the dismay of Kösem. According to one legend, Şekerpare told the Sultan that one of his concubines was plotting against him, but she didn't know which one. Despite having some of the girls in his harem tortured to give up this information, Ibrahim was unsuccessful in discovering the identity of the fictional woman who betrayed him. So in a fit of rage, the Sultan ordered his entire harem to be bound, sacked, weighed down, and thrown into the Bosphorus to be drowned. Only a handful of women were spared, including Şekerpare and Turan Hatice, who birthed his first son. As Ibrahim increasingly came under her influence, Kösem's standing in the palace diminished. She left the imperial palace to live in a summer house within the city. Kösem began to scheme with the Grand Vizier, Salih Pasha, to dethrone her mentally unstable son. The Sultan's advisors learned of this plot and moved his mother to the more remote Iskender Çelebi garden in Florya, a suburb of Istanbul, and had the Grand Vizier hanged. Soon, other factions moved against the Sultan, who had failed to manage state affairs properly. They, along with the new chief legal jurist and other leading officials, obtained the Queen Mother's consent for his dethronement. She did so, but first tied up the loose ends that kept him attached to power. Kösem had Şekerpare strangled. She told Ibrahim that she had died unexpectedly. By then, several of his concubines had given birth to sons, which meant the Ottoman lineage could live on and Ibrahim was expendable. She secured his deposition, execution, and replacement by his 7-year-old son, Mehmet IV, in 1648. Kösem again ruled the empire as regent through her grandson. He was the ideal sultan through which to rule. Mehmet was too young to effect change at the beginning of his reign, and when he finally came of age, was completely disinterested in government affairs. Mehmet's primary concern was with hunting and leading parties out on long expeditions. During his 4-year reign, he delegated most of his duties to his chief advisors. His hands-off reign had the unintended consequence of permanently altering the office of the sultan and weakening it considerably. But it left those in his court and inner circle with considerably more power, particularly Kösem, who was now entering her 3rd decade of rule. In recognition of her unique role in leading the empire throughout generations of royal males, she received the exalted title Büyük Valide, the grandmother of the sultan. While holding power in Ottoman politics was always a difficult affair and required assembling a messy coalition of military figures, administrators, members of the ruling dynasty, and the religious elite, and these power players were always shifting. Kösem knew that her position was never completely stable, and she finally met her match in another royal mother. This former concubine was equally skilled as the queen grandmother in her ability to manipulate the court, and that was Valide Sultan Turan Hatice, the mother of Mehmet IV. So mother and grandmother squared off. Hatice rightly believed Kösem to be plotting to have him removed so that another of her grandsons could rule, particularly one with a less ambitious mother. Kösem Sultan had secured the support of the Janissary Corps, an elite military unit that formed the backbone of the Ottoman army, and attempted to murder Mehmet IV and Turhan Hatice. They desired to replace Mehmet with his brother Süleyman, whose mother Saliha Dilashub Sultan was more pliant and less likely to interfere in state matters. The younger Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother, learned of this conspiracy and moved first. For the first time, Kösem Sultan was outgunned by a younger, faster rival. According to speculation, she was strangled herself with a silk rope by the chief black eunuch of the harem. Others even speculate that she was strangled by her own hair. She died in 1651 at the age of 61. Kösem had been an informal advisor to one sultan and directly ruled the empire as a regent for 3 others. She stands above other queen mothers due to her longevity, ability to rule through multiple generations, and authority and respect with which the male leaders of the empire considered her. She led the empire through turbulent times of warfare and political reform, maintaining the continuity of the empire when it threatened to fall apart. She was buried in the mausoleum of Sultan Ahmet on the grounds of the old palace. Kösem left behind a contradictory legacy. It was a legacy of manipulations and arranged murders within the palace, but she also showed kindness and compassion to the public. Kösem was aware of her dual nature by the end of her life. She was thought to have uttered the words, "I have chosen to let my poison out into the palace and give my milk to my people." And she did give the public much in the form of considerable humanitarian work. Much of her wealth and income was devoted to pious foundations and charitable institutions in the empire. Kösem had palace administrators seek out orphan girls, provide for their education, and arrange their marriages. She paid the debts of Muslims and non-Muslims consigned to debtor's prison. She treated her slaves well, whom she freed after 3 years of service. Some of the institutions she commissioned, including shelters for travelers, public soup kitchens, and large imperial mosques in the Istanbul district of Üsküdar, which still stands today. She also financed irrigation works in Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the empire, and disaster relief for the poor in Mecca. Her image as a humanitarian and benefactor still survives in Turkish popular imagination today in books and movies. She's also perhaps the most successful example of a woman wielding power in a society when official high-ranking positions for women were almost non-existent. She showed that an ambitious female ruling through non-official means could be just as effective as a man doing so through formal ones. Furthermore, Kösem proved that intelligence and tact could allow someone from the lowest position to achieve extraordinary success. Her ability to stabilize the government and military earned the respect of the Sultan's court. She had a bravado combined with proven strength and courage that also earned the devotion of many high-ranking male officials. She was also a role model of sorts for women seeking to attain power. George Bernard Shaw perhaps envisioned Qasem Sultan's career when he mused about universal suffrage. Although the Irish playwright firmly supported women's rights, he also realized that indirect female influence over men could be just as powerful. He said, "Clever and attractive women do not want to vote. They're willing to let men govern as long as they govern men." It was a principle that Qasem knew well, and few did it better than she did. All right, well, that is all for this episode of Ottoman Lives. We'll see you in the next episode as we look at the cast of characters who made up the Ottoman Empire. Thanks for listening to this episode. For more information, including show notes, maps, and a bibliography, go to OttomanLives.com. Also, if you like this show, please rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. It helps us grow the show and make it easier for new listeners to discover us. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.